Welcome back to the Widening Your Aperture podcast. And this week I am joined by Kathi Kulesza, and Kathi is a public speaker. And today we're going to be talking around the topic that is, I think, difficult for a lot of people to even talk about, which is conflict resolution.
Yes, some people run from it.
Yes, yes. Run from the conflict of conflict. Yes,
Yes.
It is definitely something that I think a lot of people struggle with, having those hard conversations. How do we show up when we have conflict? And so what kind of brought you to the point where this is what you speak around in your public speaking?
It's funny because when I think back about how I originally became okay with dealing with conflict is I ran hotels. So I was a general manager.
Yeah.
And so when you're the boss and you're running a business and basically the only one there of any authority is you can't run from those situations. You have to go directly into the center of it and deal with it because it doesn't go away.
Yeah.
I mean, in most cases, it actually gets worse.
Yeah.
So people used to just be like, oh, you kind of like conflict. I'm like, it's not that I like it. It's just that I have no choice. I have to resolve it. And I remember one time I was working in the corporate office, and there was a person that was very challenging to work with. She did not work for me. And the other managers in the marketing department all would just cower and they would never address it head on. And they're like, we're going to give that person to you. And I'm like, no, you're not. She doesn't do anything related to what she was not anywhere in the realm of what I was responsible for. I'm like, no, you're not. No, I'm not taking her. And they're like, well, no, but because you're really good with dealing with these things. I'm like, well, that's not the reason why to give me the problem person, because nobody else here has the knowledge or the expertise or the willingness to resolve conflict. No, I'm not. I refuse. So it's just kind of funny because I think back, and then they gave me what they said is, which was not really, it wasn't a compliment. They're like, you're like a bull in a china shop. And I'm like, that is not a compliment. But I think their point is that I always went in head first and I just resolved situations. And working in a corporate office, a lot of people in those positions, they're definitely not operations type people. They're not dealing with problems all the time. It's mostly relationship stuff. And I was dealing with all kinds of challenges when I worked in hotels before I worked in the corporate office, customer problems, employee problems, vendor problems, and, managers. I mean, there was just so many things, problems with the city, so it was like, to me, it was an everyday occurrence. And I believe there's some stat out there that says, most managers deal with conflict 48 to 50% of your time. So I think speaking about it is because when I speak about leadership and communication, I mean, the bulk of that, most of it is around conflict.
Yeah.
So, if you're having a communication problem or you're not a good communicator, conflict stems from poor communication, the lack of communication, ineffective communication. So when you're a better communicator, it actually helps you minimize conflict or get in front of it. And most people, their biggest struggle of communication is because they need to communicate because of a conflict. So It's unavoidable.
Yes. And it sounds to me, it's like when you get more practice at doing it, the better you get, and the less, I think, apprehension you have when conflict arises. You have that self-confidence of okay, I've put the reps in at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I've built these skills. I have I've learned the communication skills. Sometimes through failure of communication, we learn what doesn't work and what does work. And I kind of included this underneath the social pillar. I think this happens a lot at work for sure, but really conflict is happening in all of our relationships. It's happening with our partner, it's happening with our friends, it's happening for sure with our families, definitely in the work environment. And so when I look at the social pillar of well-being, it's about building and maintaining positive relationships. And part of that is conflict resolution.
Yes.
And so I think that this applies to kind of all the different spheres of our life whenever we're interacting with other people. I think communication is a huge piece of this. But you kind of bring three core tenets into this as far as, the things that we need to develop for conflict resolution, which is listening skills, assertive communication and then asking questions to understand the other person. So let's maybe jump in first to listening skills, because I do think this is an area where a lot of people, they think they're listening, but there's a lot of different types of listening. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So it's funny. So I'm naturally when I was younger, I was definitely extroverted. And, but I was in positions of customer service and running hotels and being a manager, leader, boss, that I had to be communicating. And, I had to be able to communicate with all different types of people. And I was put in situations where I was leading teams, leading events. So, you just kind of, even if you're not loving being an extrovert, you kind of get good at that. Right.
Yeah.
And when you lean towards extrovert, the great thing about extroverts is they're going to carry the conversation. They're going to keep it going. They're good at rapport building. That, a lot of them can be kind of funny, witty, on their feet. And so, it helps the introverts because there's somebody else carrying the weight. But the problem a lot of times extroverts have is we're not that great at listening, because it's really hard to be listening when you're actually doing all the talking.
Sure.
So I really had to hone my listening skills, because they don't teach you how to listen, even in college. I mean, there's no classes really that people take on listening until they take a communications class and then learn intellectually about listening. Yeah. So I have practiced this skill quite, because sometimes it's kind of funny. I'm like, all right, today I'm going to work on listening, and the key for me for listening is I have to listen and not try to solve the problem.
Yes.
Because
if that's a big problem for a lot of people, is like you're already trying to come up with a solution, or like, how am I going to respond to this, versus just stopping all the static, everything, and actually really listening to what the person is saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And more importantly is listening for the emotions.
Yes.
Because what happens is, and I was a general manager, so I was a jack of all trades, a master of none. I worked in corporate office positions, in leadership positions, and all I did was solve problems all day long. And so you're just like, you get in this habit of solve, fix, fix, fix. And what happens is eventually over time, and I'm not really a task-oriented person, but I became one, the emotions and all that icky stuff gets in the middle and interrupts your ability to solve problems. And then you're just like, okay, people, can we not just move on? But the problem is, no, they can't, because they're human beings and they have these feelings and emotions. And when you skip over that, you've actually not solved the problem.
Right.
Because the problem is not the problem. The problem is how they feel about the problem. And so when you skip over that, the problem's still there. It's just you think in your mind you've solved it, but you really haven't. So it's really about listening for understanding of what that person's feeling, what they're going through. And I mean, this happens in customer service. Like when you put yourself as the customer, if you get bad customer service and they go to fix it right away, but they don't apologize and they don't empathize with how irritating and inconvenient and all these things, the ripple effect it had on you at that moment, which also has to do with just your adrenaline flowing and all that. And they just go, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and make this adjustment. Boom. And they never say they're sorry. You're just like, are you satisfied? No.
Right. You're just trying to brush it over, right?
Yeah. I was inconvenienced,
Yeah.
So it's like, and you feel it when you're in that situation, but when you're the one solving it, you forget that there's all these other parts of this conflict or this challenge you're having, which is really the human being and the emotions they're going through. And I think that's the downside of getting really good at going into conflict and solving it and using and just trying to get to the bottom of the problem. Sometimes we forget really the core of the problem is not the problem itself. It's the human being and the emotions and how they're feeling. So listening skills, the core, one of the core things you've got to do is try to understand what it is that they're feeling. Are they pissed? Are they angry? Are they sad? Are they upset? Are they disappointed? Are they just overall just in, and the crazy thing too about it is that those emotions are not just that event.
Right.
It's them.
Yes.
It's the core emotions they feel as a human being. And, I mean, you and we could go down a rabbit hole on this, but it's proof of something else they already believe.
Yes.
right? And then
100%.
it
Yeah.
just, yeah. So it's just piling on to something else that's already going on in their life.
Yes. Or
right?
something, I think sometimes too, it's a past thing, maybe that they've been in a situation that made them feel these
Mhm.
similar emotions. And so there's that almost like a trigger response to it,
Yes.
but it's the story that they're telling themselves in their head that you've got to like bring that to the surface, because that's the actual root of the problem, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily this particular situation or this person. It's, you've got to get, what's that story or that belief, that limiting belief that lays
Yes.
below the surface that you've got to kind of bring up. And I think, you bring up a really great point too, that it's like, I noticed this in healthcare prior to going into coaching, that a lot of the times the patients that were dissatisfied, what they really wanted was to be heard. They just wanted somebody to listen to like what was going on, instead of just being pushed in a room. This was done, and then you're pushed out. You don't get any answers.
Mhm.
Nobody's listening to like the whole story, the whole picture. And I started to pay attention to that and make the space to listen to the patient
Mhm.
prior to and after the exam. And it made this really big difference in our patient satisfaction scores. And then going to coaching training, it was, they brought up all these different types of listening, and active listening is what we practice as coaches, where it's like,
Mhm.
you're listening to the person, the situation, but you're not attaching to the story. It's like, what's underneath that? You're listening and looking kind of almost for like the body language too, of like,
Mhm.
when they start talking about this, what are they doing with their hands? Are they self-soothing? Or,
Mm.
what it kind of cues you into being able to pick up on those shifts. But you can't, like, even that is like being up in your head trying to, outthink the process, when it's just like, you just have to stop and
Mhm.
listen. And I think, another distinction too is, I think, kind of clarifying too from the beginning of the conversation, do you want to just vent? Do you
Right.
want me to fix your problem? Do you want me to offer solutions? Like, how do you want me, what's the best way for me to show up and support you in this situation?
Mhm. Yeah. And I remember I got really good at that as a manager, because some of my managers just wanted me to listen. So I would always say, can you just tell me,
Yeah.
am I helping you fix this, or do you just need to get this off your chest?
Yeah.
And then I would know, okay, I can just relax and just let them talk and not
Yeah.
worry about me trying to solve it. I mean, and that's a really good point. Sometimes it's that simple. It's just like, because especially if you're a fixer,
Yes.
and a lot of us, when we learn those task oriented skills, we just want to check it off, get it fixed, and move on. And if you're a problem solver, a fixer, task oriented person, that's a really important question to learn to ask, because now that person's telling you, I don't need you to fix it, I know that's what you do, but I just need you to listen. And it's hard as a task oriented person to stop and listen, but it's, if you can do it, they're going to really appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. How do you think, if somebody wants to work on maybe their listening skills, thinking back to when you kind of made this discernment of like, okay, I need to, not be in this to find the solution or fix the problem. I need to just listen. What were kind of some of the ways that you went about approaching how to become a better listener?
Well, so it's funny because I always joke about how I have to sit on my hands
I'm a hand talker too.
so I won't talk. And I don't know why, but it does help me. I'll tell you a funny story. So I'm always trying to pay attention, because also it's certain people in your life,
Yeah.
right? So some people, you just lose the tolerance for listening because they just go down a rabbit hole, and you're just like, oh, like, it's going nowhere. They don't want help. They don't want ideas. They don't want advice. They don't want suggestions. And all you want to do is just bring an end to it,
Yeah.
and the only reason I'm going to tell this story is because God bless my mother. She doesn't listen to podcasts, because she's too old at this point. So my mom and I were in Toastmasters,
Mhm.
which is a place where you go to practice your speaking. This was so do you measure everything pre-pandemic and post-pandemic?
Right. Yeah.
So pre-pandemic, when we used to meet in person, and she needed to figure out how to use the website. She's now 80, I guess she's 82. No, 81. She's 81. I don't know, maybe 81, 82, maybe she was turned 82. I don't know. And so, she's older, right? So she's like 77, 78. Computers are not her her number one skill. So she comes over to my house. We sit down with her laptop. I show her what to do and how to do it. We kind of go through and I let her practice. And then we just sit there having conversation. And I'm like, I'm just going to practice my mom listening skills. Cause quite honestly, my mom, God bless her, but she just likes to complain and talk about things and she doesn't want to fix it. She just wants to, have a conversation about people that annoy her. And so I'm like, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and not try to fix it because I am a coach. And when people have, and she's complaining about relationships with other people, like I want to give you suggestions on how to approach it differently, but I know she doesn't really want to do that. She just wants to complain. So I'm like, all right, I'm just going to let her vent and complain.
Yeah.
So I basically say nothing.
Yeah.
And I just let her go. And eventually she goes, I'm just going to leave. And I was like, what's going on? She goes, well, you're not contributing anything to this conversation. And I was like, oh my gosh, I figured out how to get my mom to stop complaining, but that really wasn't a win because now the problem is by saying nothing. And that's like listening is not saying nothing, right? Listening is a two-way conversation. It's just you're doing less of the talking and more of the listening, but you can't not talk at all. Right. Yeah. So it's like, there's a delicate line of how much is enough listening and how much is too much, where now the person thinks you're not even in the conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Engaged in it. Yeah.
So, I teach 80% listening, 20% talking. I don't, that's a number bunch, we throw out to leaders. I'm not sure if that's exact right amount. It probably depends on the person, but you can't not say anything. You have to be able to show the person that you're listening. And that's where asking questions sometimes comes in because, I learned with my mom that to giving her suggestions and advice is not what she wanted. And I actually had a friendship fall apart, same thing, because I just got annoyed because every time I tried to help them fix it, they would get pissed off at me because they just wanted to complain. They lived in a negative place and they got something from complaining. There was some, and you probably know more about it than me, but there was some payoff for doing that. And we all probably enjoy a little complaining once in a while, right?
Sure.
It's just some people do it more than others. And so there is a delicate balance and you have to decide how important that person is in your life. I mean, this is my mom, right? So, learning to listen without giving her suggestions and asking enough questions or giving her enough of a response so she feels like she's being listened to, and there's no exact science. Each person that you deal with and you interact with is different, and how important that person is to you depends on how much effort you're going to put in to figure out what the right mix is. But it probably is around 80-20, 70-30.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely, and I think it's probably, again, it's probably situational. It's probably depending on who you're dealing with. You mentioned like the introvert, extrovert, differences. And I think when I think about that, I never really actually made that distinction. But when you were talking about it, I'm like, that's so true, right? Like I have extrovert friends that I like, you just got to let them go until they get to that point of like almost exhaustion, where it's just like, okay, now it's time for you to like engage in the conversation because I'm feeling like I've released that. Whereas the introverts are people a few words, they feel like they can express it in a short, succinct sentence. And there's more, I think, talking with that person versus listening. I think some people are also very good at just like, they are very in tune with what they're feeling. They've maybe made the connection between the story that they're telling themselves. They've recognized the pattern, whatever the situation might be, that they can get directly to like, okay, here's the issue. Or the area of conflict, and you can just dive right in. Whereas other people, you kind of have to like massage that out of all of the other pieces of it. So I do think this is why I think it's called like the art of communication, right? Is because you have to figure this out with every single person. And I can imagine as a leader, and then not only that, but being in a service industry, you're dealing with all like a whole spectrum of
Mhm.
different personalities, different people that you have to kind of figure out. And you don't always have necessarily time on your side of getting to know that person, knowing how they operate when
Mhm.
you're doing customer service, or like in my case, patient care. You get like that interaction to kind of like figure it out. Um, so that you kind of segued into one of the other tenets. So I think, let's dive down that path about asking questions in an effort to understand the other person. I know for like, as far as coaching goes, this would be for us, like being curious,
Mhm.
which I think is kind of a two-way street. It's also being curious about yourself. Like when people are talking, what's coming up for you too,
Mhm.
that you need to be aware of. And I think that can affect sometimes how we show up. But let's dive into like the questions that we ask others to kind of understand a little bit more about them and the root of the conflict.
So I mean, the number one question that you can ask, as long as you don't sound like a 3-year-old, is why. But you just can't be like, why? And there's this, I picked it up along the way. There's this great example of the difference between like the conflict, which is what people want. And that's usually where the conflict lies, is what I want is different from what you want. And we are really clear and really dead set on that. This is the right what.
Yeah.
And we're sure of it. And we're right for ourselves.
Yeah.
you know, but it may not be the right what for everybody. So the way you move past the what is to ask the question why. And normally we're going to have more overlap in why we want what we want, right?
Right.
So the most experts will say, ask the question why 5 times, but you don't ask just why. You say, you listen to what they said, right? And then you ask a why question related to what they communicated. There's another thing that I just, so I teach a bunch of different classes, and there's this Socratic questioning method. I don't know if you've ever Socrates.
Oh, let's
Um,
dive. That sounds
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but he teaches this idea of asking questions and listening to discern, right? And better understand what's going on. But I think it's kind of a two-way thing, is that when you ask questions out of curiosity to help yourself understand, when you ask them right, it also can help the other person articulate better and get a better understanding for what they want, or the ripple effect of what they want and how it might impact other people. And so like one question is, can you help me understand why you're assuming that, or how you came to that assumption? So now it forces the person to think through, okay, how did I land here? Or at questions like, what do you think the outcome of this is going to be? Right. So now because me being an operations person, I'm always sometimes in awe that people don't think through the ripple effect of their actions, like how it's going to affect other things. Like I'll give you a simple, when I first moved into the house I'm in now, I moved in with a roommate. I bought the house and I got a roommate, and she's the greatest person ever. She's not an operations person. And so I've moved a million times, and not a million, but I've moved a lot. And so all my boxes are packed with, taped up and stackable, right? And labeled. And so, and neither one of us moved very far. We just moved from one place to another in Las Vegas, And so I show up with these boxes all perfectly packed with packing paper, taped shut, labeled. I know where they're going. And so my stuff comes and it's all boxes everywhere. I'm trying to get everywhere. And then she shows up and every single thing that she had packed was open. Crates, boxes, just other things you could put things in. And so it's a single layer of just stuff everywhere. And so then it's in the garage, it's in the dining room, it's in the living room. And then we're trying to make room for a piece of furniture. So then she's just moving it from one space to another. So that piece of furniture goes in. Now we've got to move it to put the other piece of furniture in. There was no ripple effect. Thinking about how every time you had to move everything 4 or 5 times, and I'm always like, let's just do it one time.
Right.
And so you can ask questions to get people thinking about what the ripple effect is going to be. And it's kind of like the Connect Four
Yeah.
game. Have you played that?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so like I played that game with one of my nieces for like maybe for a couple years. She liked playing it. She's 12 now. We probably played it when she was like 5, 6, 7 years old. And I would beat her every time. Then I'm like, okay, Abby, you got to think ahead 2 or 3 moves.
Right.
So you got to think about what move do you want to make? And then what move am I going to probably make after that? And so after I taught her to think ahead 2 or 3 moves, she started beating me, because now she's being strategic. And I think if you can think that way and you can help other people through questioning, think about the ripple effect of their actions or their decisions, that helps them thinking about the future, because where our emotions are and conflict is in the past.
Yep.
It's our fears from the past experiences we've had and what's happened to us. And we're living in that emotions. It could be 40, 20, 60 years of emotions all piled up. And when you can get the person thinking forward about a solution, it moves them away from the emotion and into thinking about getting a better outcome. I don't know. I just went down like around in circles there, but if you can ask questions to get people to think about, what they really feel and what they want the outcome to be and get them to move towards the future, you move them away from the emotions and the conflict and you get them towards thinking about having a better outcome. You can usually move through it more easily. And those questions, when you ask why questions, why do you think that's the best solution? Why are you feeling that that's how people are treating you for that reason? Why do you think that is better than this? Then you get them explaining it. And sometimes they can talk themselves through, because we all have our own best answers.
Yes.
Right. We all know what we want. We all know, what we want the result to be, but sometimes we can't articulate it because we're all caught up in this bundled mess. And if you can ask enough questions to get them kind of moving away from that and thinking about the outcome, sometimes, in most cases, you're going to get a better outcome.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, there's so much in that relates to like how we coach too. You're looking for like, what assumptions are you making, or what limiting belief is running the script here. So you're kind of, you're digging at that, but coaching is very much that forward focus where it's like, okay, you can only sit in a situation for so long before you have to start looking at like, how do I move forward and which path do I want to take? Because there's always this whole slew of choices about how you want to act.
Yes.
And I think, again, it's situational depending on whether this is like conflict resolution with your partner versus a coworker. That's going to change maybe the path that you take. But I think when you open up that perspective, right, it allows them to see not only their position from a different place, but it also allows them to see somebody else's perspective of like, oh, okay, I get how you're looking at this too. And I think when you do that, compromise comes so much easier, right? Because you're like, okay, I can give a little bit because I know this person's also flexing a little bit in this place too. So I think that's really important. I'm curious to know, speaking of curiosity, when you've been in conflict resolution with people and you have been triggered, how do you handle that?
Well, so I always assume, and this took years, so I'm a baby boomer. So, I mean, this took me decades, and it took me a lot of self-work and a lot of self-reflection. And I will tell you, one of the greatest books that I read when I was very young that is still relevant today, that helped me understand that my reaction is my reaction and my choice. Sometimes I was giving my power away a lot because I was allowing myself to be emotionally triggered and not think about what I chose to do. There was a 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I don't even know which habit it is. It might be habit 1, but it was about thinking about responding versus reacting.
Yes.
And so I learned over the years from one of the brilliant people, and there's been many that have bestowed knowledge on me, is that when somebody is pissing me off, there's probably something about that person that I don't like about myself.
Yeah.
And then I have to be like, okay, what is this? What am I seeing? What's the mirror that this person's holding up to me that I'm so freaking pissed off that something I hate about myself or have hated about myself that this person is showing me? And
Mhm.
so it's not them, it's me. And I also tell people the same thing. When somebody else is treating you badly or talking negatively to you, or even making accusations of you or cursing at you, whatever it is, it's them. It has
Yes.
nothing to do with you. You just happen to be the person in front of them.
Right.
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 And so you can't take it personally, because my sister gave me this meme one time because we were talking about conflict. And she goes, have you ever seen a little meme? It's like the enemy is the inner me.
Yeah.
Right. So I always go, okay, this is me, not them.
Yeah.
Right. I can be in control and figure out what's going on with me and choose my response or walk away. Right.
Yep.
Or I can react. And when I do that, I give all my power away.
Yep.
Because now I'm not in control and I've given my power to somebody else or situation. And that always feels a lot worse.
Yep.
Than just owning up the fact that you're just being a jerk at the moment and, you're not liking yourself. It's always better to look within and go, what's going on with me that I'm feeling this way? And sometimes you uncover it, sometimes you don't. I will say this. So my mom has Alzheimer's and she has no short-term memory. She has no capacity to change anything about herself now.
Right.
Because in order to make changes in your mindset and your belief system and how you see yourself in your life, you need short-term memory because you have to be able to create new habits to make changes. Well, she does not have the capacity to do that. So there's a point in life if you end up, and we all will have some memory loss, where you're going to lose the ability to make lasting changes in your belief system, and your belief system, your mindset, your thinking, whether it's stinking thinking or good thinking, is what's going to carry you through. And eventually you're going to be stuck in the movie of your life that you wrote.
Yeah.
And so you do that work now, or you're going to be stuck in a loop that could be a torturous belief system about yourself. And that my poor mom, God bless her, she did a lot of things in her life and accomplished a lot of things. She has 6 kids. She has a doctorate in English and education, but she never worked on that.
Yeah.
And never got over some of her self-limiting beliefs that she carried for many years. And now she doesn't have the capacity to change it. And we're all experiencing it through that movie that's showing. And she's reliving that part of her life. And really she's stuck in like her when she was 50 or 60 years old, not 80. And we just have to be accepting and loving, but it's hard.
Yeah.
And this is probably in your career, this. I mean, this is the thing that's going to define our generations right now.
Yes.
Is the aging of our parents and our grandparents. And this is going to get worse. Because I'm 61, I'm next, right?
Yeah.
We have 2 giant generations that are aging, and we do not have the capacity to help them with mental health, with their physical health, with healthcare in general. Right. I mean, you see it, it's funny because you're like, well, you worked in management, but really one of my biggest things that I'm dealing with right now is my mom and healthcare around her. And even when you go to like neuropsychology appointments, like they can tell you what's going on with the brain, but they can't help you emotionally. I mean, it's missing, it's lacking. Right. And this is going to define the generations right now. It's going to define the baby boomers. It's going to define Generation X and the millennials, because a lot of them are dealing with these aging parents and grandparents, and nobody's equipped. Right. And it really comes down to conflict, and the conflict is within us. We bring the conflict to every relationship. And if you're lucky enough to have other siblings, like I'm the oldest of 5 kids, trust me, there's conflict on how to deal with my mom.
Oh yeah.
Like my leadership experience, my communication experience, everything I've done for 30 plus years in the hospitality industry, it has all been tested with my family, because that is a much harder communication situation than anything I've ever dealt with. Running hotels, being in a corporate position, it is all been tested in dealing with siblings and making decisions about my mother. That is the true test. And so that's where it's more important. There's more at stake. And my only goal is that me and my siblings still love each other when my mom, eventually passes away, because there's a chance that we might not. It's hard. That's
It
all hard.
is.
I mean, that's really where, forget about work, practice those skills at work.
Yes.
Where you really need it is in these relationships of these people that are your family,
Yeah.
right? Making huge decisions about somebody's life and the end of life.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. I mean, that is so, I mean, there's so much gold in all of that. But what like really hits home for me. So I lost my dad in June of this year. And what you're saying is just, I mean, it's just all so fresh because
mhm,
it happened unexpectedly. It kind of
mhm,
came out of nowhere. Like we knew that there was an issue that was gonna like we knew this was going to happen down the line. I think it just
yeah,
happened a lot sooner than we thought it would. And then we really thought, and it was a very, I think it was realistic to think he was going to make a recovery, maybe not to full capacity again, but that it was like he was going to like have more years in front of him. And then literally everything shifted. We ended up back in Denver. He's septic, decides to come home, and the palliative team had told us, you've got 5 to 6 months. So make sure that, you guys are spending time and like getting what you want out of it. And he passed away 2 weeks to the day
mhm,
after he came home. And that was
yeah,
obviously much faster than we had anticipated. And
yeah,
the communication between siblings, I mean, my younger sister, we've always struggled with communication a little bit. My brother and I have always been very good communicators, but it was a situation that we had never dealt with before.
mhm,
This had never been relevant to us. And
yeah,
it required developing that communication, breaching new subjects that we thought we weren't necessarily ever going to have
mhm,
to talk about. And looking down the road futuristically, it's like now we know what is going to come up with mom, and
mhm,
that's going to happen. So what can we learn from this situation to move forward? And I
yes,
think you're so right. Like, I think a lot of people look at conflict resolution at work as being the most difficult thing to deal with, like the difficult coworker, the difficult
mhm,
boss, not being heard or seen by, your coworkers or upper management, whatever it might be. But I do think with family, it's so much harder
mhm,
because there's that attachment to them and there's that
yes,
that deep bond that I think sometimes when we have to deal with conflict, it is more difficult because we're trying to navigate like this huge sense of belonging. It's like, I
mhm,
don't want to be in a rift with my siblings or with my parents because this is who I belong to
mhm,
in that sense. I know like when Cheryl and I had the conversation around boundaries, it was
mm,
like, man, laying boundaries with family is like so much harder than it is laying boundaries at work or boundaries with
yes,
friends or boundaries in romantic relationships.
yeah,
So I think that is incredibly true. And like I could go down the whole rabbit hole around healthcare,
mhm,
and the deficiencies in that aspect. But another great point that you brought up is our parents' generation. They didn't talk about mental health. They didn't talk about problems.
nothing,
There wasn't conflict resolution. You just got over it, moved on, but held on to that resentment for how many years,
yeah,
later. Whereas now this is an open discussion. We're talking
yes,
about this, we're developing these skills. But as somebody who's really started to do the inner work and like seeing how my relationships were reflecting back to me the parts of my
mhm,
like my shadow self in a sense, it was harder to uproot those beliefs
mhm,
and harder to make those changes at 40 than I
mhm,
think it would have been if I had been 25, 30 and
yeah,
made these realizations and started doing the work on myself at that point. So that's a
yeah.
very, very good point.
Well, in our parents, the other complication with this is most of our limiting beliefs, I mean, like it or not, parents,
Yeah.
they come from the parents.
Yes.
So my father also died. He died in 2021.
Hmm.
Um, he not from COVID. I mean, he just, drank and had a good life,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he lasted a lot longer than we thought he would have. That's where I'm like, we're not going to have this happen again, where he's dying and my one sister, like, she didn't communicate well enough to everybody that everybody understood he was dying.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I asked her enough questions when she was trying to communicate with all of us what was going on, that I'm like, okay, there's no turning back. He's dying.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, we have to have a Zoom call. I mean, we're all in Vegas, but I'm like, we all have to get on a Zoom call, and you need to explain to everybody that he's dying. She goes, no, I've told them. I go, no, they don't all understand. that he's dying.
Yes.
And I remember getting on this Zoom call at like 9:30 at night. One of my sisters is at T-Mobile, at some event. And my brother was like, let's get him into an emergency room. Let's get him some oxygen. And I'm like, no, he's dying. And so we get on the Zoom call and I just asked her enough questions that they could hear the questions and the answers, and they could all on their own understand this was it. He was dying this week, and so with my mom, and my dad, it was different just because of the kind of dad he was, that, there was really one sibling mostly involved in towards the end of his life. My mom, it's a different situation with all the kids, it's all very complicated. Right.
Yep.
And we all, and it's so like all of how we define ourselves as humans and the stories we have about ourselves are so closely tied to our parents that is also in the mix in all of this.
Yeah.
It's so complicated. And so, you can practice these skills at work in these different situations, but you're really going to be tested, and everyone will be tested. Most people will be tested. I realize not everybody has, parents probably even, but there'll be somebody in your life where it's that much closer to you, and there'll be some conflict around what to do. And we are already having that. And we've had many situations with my mom where we're not in agreement. And we just have to find our way through it. And sometimes it's, and it's one of the things I talk about is the roots of conflict. And one of the roots of conflict is values conflict. Yes. So values conflict are deep seated belief systems related to religion, politics, norms, your belief system, which the irony is, even in a family, like we really grew up in two households, same parents, but there's like older siblings, and we're like 3 years apart, within 3 years apart. And then I've got a middle brother. There's three of us that are older, one in the middle, and then two younger who are 18 years younger than me. So there was like kind of two households when my mom and dad were still married together. And then my dad went out and did jobs, and they were kind of separated. And then that was a different household. And we had different parents, even though they're the same parents.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so we're trying to work through all of that. And then you think we grew up in the same house. We don't have the same political beliefs, same religious beliefs, same beliefs around whether or not to get a vaccine, what decisions to make about healthcare, money. I mean, there's all these different, variations of conflict. And they're all being brought up around my mom's healthcare, where she lives, the decisions around money. I mean, it's all involved.
Yep.
And unfortunately, in your personal situations, you have to deal with values conflicts, whereas at work, a lot of those can be left out of work.
Yes.
And that's what complicates the conflict with family, is that those values conflicts cannot be ignored. Yep. Where those decisions have to be made around family members, where at work, most values conflicts, politics and religion, you can leave out of work. You can say, you know what? I respect the fact that you like that candidate or don't like this candidate, or you're this religion or that. That has nothing to do with our work.
Yes. Correct.
Whether you think the pandemic was real or not, whether you think the vaccines are helpful or not, all those things you can leave out of work, right? Unless I guess you're in healthcare and you're required to have a vaccine, but most of that you can leave out of work. In your family, it's all involved, and that's the truth. I mean, so we could talk about this for like 3 days, right?
Oh my gosh, I know. Like even as you're like expanding on this, I'm like, okay, so it's not just my family, because it was like you took an already difficult situation of like, loss and grief, and then it got compounded by like, well, the family. You start to realize all the family dynamics, right? That you never realized before. And I think part of this is just around the self-awareness. And then you're like, oh, that's where this came from, is like, this is how we've always functioned. And my sister is 12 years younger than I am, 15 years younger than my brother. Yeah. So it was very different households, very different parenting. And even my brother, we're 4 years apart. And he's like, I dealt with different parents than you did, because they were still just figuring out like how to be married, how to have kids, what parenting looked like. So like I saw the sheer level of stupidity that was possible, but then they figured things out through me. So when they got to you, you got a different set of parents than what I had experienced. And I think we kind of forget that sometimes, but my dad died without a will. And so that complicated everything, because then their wishes aren't even stated. And
Yes.
every single one of us had a different interpretation of like what he
Mhm.
would have wanted, because we had a different interpretation of him. And I think that is, yeah, gosh, it's such a difficult, sticky situation to navigate. I think if there's anything that I would say to listeners out there is like, do that work now. Like,
Yes.
the relationship building, have these conversations when you're not in a space of grief and loss, have
Yes.
them when everything is relatively okay,
Mhm.
so that when you get to these situations, and I feel like that's, you know, sometimes there is that expectation of death, right? But I think the majority of the time it happens faster or differently than how we think it's going to
Mhm.
happen. And I think when you have these things worked out prior to it, it's just going to make the ability to grieve and process that situation easier.
Yes.
So kudos to you and your siblings for kind of getting, I think too, recognizing like what didn't work in the first round. And it's like, we need to
Yeah.
be more cohesive in this next go
Well,
round.
the first round, the easy part is most everybody just kind of let the one sibling deal with it.
Yeah.
The problem is now there is disagreements on, where my mom should live. Most of us believe she should stay in her house, but that's what we believe she wants. That's not the easy thing,
Yeah. Yep.
keeping her in her house. My brother, one of my brothers moved in with her. God bless him. He's the least experienced in emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And he is learning emotional intelligence through a fire hose.
I was going to say that's a crash course right there.
Yeah. And it's like trying to teach a guy that's, he's nothing against him. He's like an amazing, loving brother, but he's never been in management or leadership. He's single, he's never really learned really great listening skills. He's just this 51, soon to be 51-year-old bachelor. And he moved in with my mom. And I'm like, John, John, don't try to fix it. Don't try to make her feel better. Don't tell her to be happy. Just hear her out and then try to acknowledge the emotions she's having.
Yes.
And then you'll hear him like, Mom, I can hear that you're telling me that this is very frustrating and, you're just really sad right now. And God bless him. I mean, he's grown so much and he's been there a year with her. He's grown so much, but he's never going to be perfect. But he's the person that can live with her. It's like, wow. Cause I've had a lifetime of experience of learning how to listen and say things and practice. And he's having to learn it and, like with the fire hose.
Yes.
It's so, yeah. And I know we need to move off the whole family thing, but I will say this, if you are in a position where your family, your parents are still relatively healthy, they still have their minds. I would even say get a trust.
Yeah.
And make sure the parents are really clear on, and I would not have one person do both. There should be somebody who is the person for the medical and somebody's who's the person for the financial, because it's better to have two different people that are going to end up with that responsibility. And then make sure everyone is really clear on what the parents want, and be clear what you want. In a way that here's how even if they don't agree with you, that they can say back, they can articulate what you want. So they may not agree that you want to stay in your house as long as possible, but they can say, I understand you want to stay in your house as long as possible. They may not agree with it, but they can articulate it. And I think that's the thing is and I'm, 61. So I have a lot of people with a lot of opinions tell me, but a family trust or a trust is the best way because you don't have to go through probate.
Yep.
And the responsibility of those decisions just gets transferred over almost, much easier than when somebody dies.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
So yeah. And
it
you
is
don't
a
want
messy situation to deal with this after death. So yeah, that's the PSA of this is take care of, handle these things now while everybody is in a.
And the other PSA is we are all aging and our minds eventually will not have as much capacity. Today, you have the most capacity to work on your limiting beliefs, which is which causes you conflict. So even though you think the conflict is the other person, you are the conflict.
Yes.
So your
100%.
best ability to be in a better position to improve your relationships and deal with conflict is to work on your own mindset, your own thinking, your stinking thinking, work on that right now, because tomorrow you're going to have less capacity, and 10 years from now, even less. And eventually you will not have the capacity to change your story, and you'll be stuck in a rerun of the movie of your life. And the worst stories you have about yourself are the ones that are going to premiere.
Yep.
For your
the
end of
highlight
years.
reel.
That's a highlight reel. And my mom's, she has a little bit of caregiving that we've done. And I happened to by accident meet the owner of the company that we try to have like one day a week help come in. And I was telling him, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. No, my mom's a horrible person to the caregivers. And he goes, no, they're all horrible to the caregivers.
Yeah.
It's like, that's part of what happens. They get old, they're mean, they're angry. All of their beliefs they've had since the 50s and 60s have bubbled up. They treat people really badly because they never really fixed this. They just stuffed down, and they acted in a way they thought was the best way to act, but they never really changed the thinking. They just changed their behavior. And all of that, those changes don't stick, but their true beliefs and the way they view the world come back up. And he said, yeah, most old people are really mean, and your mom's not anywhere close to as mean as some of the other ones. I'm like, okay, well, I guess that's good to know.
Right. It's like, okay, so that makes me feel a little bit better. And, I noticed this with my dad too. Like I ultimately was his full-time caretaker for the last 6-ish months of his life.
Yeah.
And he would get just downright mean with me sometimes.
Yeah.
And I, through talking with him, it was like, when somebody's facing serious health issues and knows that like death is a real possibility for them, there's a reckoning that's going on in that person. There's a lot of anger about the things that they didn't do or say in their life. They're processing all this internal stuff that a lot of times can bring up this anger. And it's not necessarily at the person that's directed at, it's more within themselves. Again, this comes back to like, look back inside of you, like, what is this really about? And I think that if we start to do that work ourselves and uproot those angers, and we don't have those regrets at the end of like, I wish I would have said this to that person, or I wish I would have done this thing. There's so much less internal animosity and chaos that you have to work through. And then you're not directing that anger at whoever might be taking care of you, whether that be family members or outside caretakers. So that,
every conflict we have, we are part of that conflict. And in many cases, then that's one of the main things I teach, is that when I teach conflict management, is that all the changes have to happen within you. And then those changes, if you're lucky, will influence a change in the other person. But you are the one that has to change. So you can't change other people. I'll give you a little story. It's just kind of a simple thing. We get off this, like, if we're triggering anyone, we're sorry, but this is, we have the similarity of what we've gone through in our lives last few years. So I was, when I first moved back to Vegas, I was working for MGM Resorts. I think it was called MGM Mirage at the time. So I got this job. A guy hires me. I come in. 10 days later, he leaves the company. I've got this team of like 30 people, and I need an executive assistant. And so one of my directors, who is new to me, says, oh, I've got this great person. She'll be a great executive assistant. I'm like, okay. So I hire her, and it was a nightmare. We were like, it was just, the relationship was not a really good relationship. And she was kind of like, to me, she was kind of like being biatchy, like not nice, and I'm like, and the main person she was executive assistant to was me. Right. So, and I'm going to meetings every day, 4 days a week. I'm never in the office. I need her to like help me with my emails, manage my calendar. And it was rough. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to have a conversation with her and decide if I'm going to keep her or start writing her up and maybe get rid of her. And Stephen Covey, one thing I learned from him in the 7 Habits is you can always re-choose your situation. So you can change it or you can re-choose it, which means you can like erase and then start over and just accept it for what it is. So I'm like, maybe my idea was I'm going to sit down with her and try to rehire her in my mind. So, because I didn't want to have to go find another executive assistant. She transferred within the company. She had a lot of skills. She knew everybody, but we were just not getting along. So I do this one-on-one with her, and we sit in my office. And I'm like, hey, I just want to I'm feeling like we're not gelling, and I just want to make sure there's something that I haven't done that's causing us to have this tension between us. And she goes, well, as a matter of fact, there is. I'm like, what you talking about? I'm
Wasn't
like,
expecting that.
yeah. Well, kind of, but not. Yeah. Yes
Yeah.
and no. I'm like, okay, well, what is it? And she goes, well, every time you come to your office, you never say hello or greet me or anything. Now, here's the funny thing is my pet peeve is you should really show respect and love for the people that work for you. But can I curse? It was a shit show. I mean,
Dumpster fire.
I've been there like 3 weeks. My boss left after 10 days. I've got a new boss that's like 5 levels ahead of me. Nobody's helping me. I'm going to these meetings. It's a political crazy place because everybody thinks everybody wants their job. It was MGM Mirage at the time. So there was Mirage people, there was MGM people, there were Mandalay Bay people. None of them got along. It was very political. And I'm driving up and down the strip trying to meet with all these people that work in, gaming marketing. And they all think I want to be a slot marketing director or whatever. I'm like, no, I don't want your job. I just want to help you. And so I'm exhausted, overwhelmed, and in over my head. And then I'm having this problem with this gal. And she's like, and I'm like, and the funny thing is that I would walk down a hall and her office was in this little cutout. Mm-hmm. I'd walk past her into my big, office there with my big, executive director desk. And she was right. I would be so much in just my head. I would walk by and grunt, many times a day. And I was like, is there anything else? And she said, no, that's it. And I said, okay. Her name was Brooke. She was great. I said, Brooke, listen, I said, I am so sorry. You're absolutely right. I can't imagine what it feels like to have your boss, the main boss, just blow past you and not like even acknowledge you.
Yeah.
I'm like, I actually pride myself in being a much better boss. I promise you from this day forward, I will fix this.
Yep.
And so there was no conversation about her being a little bit on edge, and we were both being biatchy. We were both having this conflict together. But the problem was that now, could have I said, look, you're being kind of, not friendly to me? Sure. But the reality is my behavior towards her is what ripple effect, right? Yep. So I could have said something to her about her behavior, but the reality is I wasn't even being the type of boss I want to be, right? Yep. So I changed, and guess what? So did she.
Yep.
And I didn't have to say anything to her about her behavior. I said, hey, there's something wrong here. Is there something I'm doing?
Yep.
And come to find out, it wasn't something I was doing. It was something I wasn't doing.
Yeah.
I wasn't acknowledging her. So I changed, and our relationship was immediately better. And she was amazing. And she saved me from so many bad situations. And so I did rehire her that day, and we level set, and I changed how I treated her. She did not. And then she changed, but not because I asked her to, not because I told her to, just because I changed my treatment of her. Yep. She changed the way she treated me. So it's that simple, but you have to be willing to throw yourself on the sword, because you are probably doing something that's creating a reaction from the other person. Somebody has to ask a question and understand that they are part. We're both here. And then the other advice I've ever given, and I try to do this myself, it's not easy, is take 100% responsibility.
Yeah.
Don't say 50-50. You take 100% responsibility for the results you're getting from the person. And if you do everything you can, you're 100% committed to being the best person you can in the relationship, and that person doesn't reciprocate, then love them from a distance.
Yep.
Then you end that relationship, but you give it every chance you can. And then if they don't reciprocate, then you just, and if it's an employee, I mean, it's a little bit harder than if it's a friend.
Yep.
But, I've had some relationships end because they just aren't able. It's not you, it's them. They're just not in a place where they can give you what you need back. And that's okay.
Yep.
And that's part of like Cheryl with the bounty. I have the book back here, part of it is accepting full responsibility for the relationship and knowing when to move on, or when you're giving what you're giving and it's not being reciprocated, that you choose to keep giving when it's not reciprocated, or you choose to change the nature of that relationship.
Yeah.
And you honor yourself. You know, you
I'm
honor
a
yourself.
huge fan of Brene Brown, and
Oh yeah.
she talks about, you know, how to, when you're in these situations where it's like something, the communication is broken down. And I think this actually came in Dare to Lead. So it was focused on leadership and how you can hone your leadership skills, the communication skills. And she offered this dialogue that, like, after I read the book, I literally went and used the exact words for words in a situation at work. And it was, the story that I'm telling myself is,
Hmm.
and you say what it is, like how you're perceiving it, or what you perceive the problem to be, or like there's this tension or this friction between us.
Mhm.
But you also, on the other side of that, have to be open to, if they say, yeah, that's 100% spot on, or that's exactly how I feel.
Mhm.
Because that's what happened to me. I was like, you know, the story I'm telling myself is that you know, you guys are kind of teamed up together, and I feel like I
Mhm.
am getting all of the shifts that nobody really wants, and that you guys really don't like me or
Mhm.
want to have anything to do with me. And she was like, no, you're right on. And it's like, oh, okay, well, so there's that. But then I
Yeah.
think that's an important point, is that we're not going to get along and be buddies and friends and connected with everybody in our lives. Everybody's in
Yes.
different spaces, and it's accepting that I'm not for everybody. That's okay.
Yes.
But we still have to have some sort of working relationship in that sense.
Yes.
It's like you said, it's easier with friends to just draw that boundary and be like, we don't mesh, or this, you
Mhm.
know, we've got a values conflict or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, in your work environment, sometimes you just have to draw that line and say, like, we're not ever going to see this eye to eye.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of times I think people are dealing again with their own stuff, and they're maybe not at that place where they can meet you where you are.
Mhm.
And so I think you just have to kind of accept it and be like, how can we make this just a working, functional relationship
Yeah.
with maybe minimal communication?
Yeah.
And everybody's at that part, you know, kind of copacetic. So I think that's a very important point to make when we're looking at dealing with conflict.
Yeah.
So to circle in back into the third kind of tenet, and we've talked about this, I think this thread has kind of come into the conversation several times, but I like the term that you use in this, assertive communication skills.
Mhm.
So what do you mean by assertive? Because I think a lot of
Well,
people might misrepresent that.
yeah. So it's kind of so, and you kind of already touched on it, like the Brene Brown version of how to communicate. So there, you know, in general, there's passive, aggressive, and assertive,
Mhm.
right? So Cheryl, you know, kind of what she defined as not being able to say no, not building boundaries, that is more, tends to be more of a passive, right, situation where you know what you want, but you don't say no, you don't say yes.
Yeah.
So you just end up, right, taking on more or helping people when you're really not even helping yourself,
Right.
right? So, and that's passiveness. Passive is not necessarily saying yes, but you're not saying no, not now, not me, you know, or negotiating due
Yep.
dates, deadlines, or your part in the situation. So passive communicators typically, they do not advocate for themselves. They end up putting other people's priorities ahead of their own. And so they end up usually not honoring their own wants, their own desires, and doing the best they can to take care of themselves because they're so busy, caught up helping everybody
Yep.
else. And so that's passiveness. So there's this idea. So Carol S. Price is kind of like the mother of assertive communication skills. She taught classes probably back in the 80s and 90s. If you found videos, I mean, that outfits are the 80s and 90s. But she's
Shoulder
still
pads and everything.
yeah, yeah. You know, the poofy hair, but it's still
Yeah.
the greatest. I mean, all assertiveness training probably came from her perspective, right? So the basically one of the things they say is when you're a passive communicator, you violate your own rights
Mm.
because you don't advocate for yourself. So I now, and I've also quoted in Cheryl's book, but now I talk about like, you know, I'm like, if you're a passive communicator, you don't create healthy boundaries, you don't know how to say no, not now, not me, buy the book because
Yep.
because the other thing that's brilliant about her book is first of all, she's funny. She's much funnier than I am. She's hilarious. She writes about what's going on because she's got a psychology degree. So she understands it because she's been there and lived it. And then she gives you a way to overcome it and gives you homework. So, and it's freaking hysterical too.
It is.
If it was only about psychology, I wouldn't be able to read the book. So, but she's also so freaking funny. So that passive people violate their own rights. Aggressive communicators violate the rights of others. So, and here's the thing is it all comes down to your self-esteem and self-image and how you feel about yourself. So if you don't really value yourself, you could end up becoming passive because you're not putting the value, you're violating your own rights. You're not valuing yourself. You have limiting beliefs. Like that may be that you don't, that you should be helping others before you help yourself. And, you've got to work on that self-talk. Well, an aggressive communicator is probably the same thing.
Yeah.
They are insecure. They really have low self-esteem, but to overcome it, they have to win for everybody else to lose. Now, I would be careful because I'm a baby boomer. We're a very competitive generation.
Yeah.
So this is another complex thing because the competitiveness could be generational, right? Yeah. So baby boomers and maybe even more seasoned Gen Xers, because I hate the word older, Gen Xers that are closer to baby boomers, work and culture was all about winning, about being number one, about getting, like even when you think about airline miles, like people don't care about that as much, getting airline miles and status and upgrades, that's a generational thing too. Now there's a little bit difference from being aggressive and demeaning people and belittling people and putting them down because you're doing a comparison game that I'm better than you.
Yeah.
Right. And that's aggressiveness. Aggressive people are going to use the word you to blame people for, like, when something goes wrong, they're going to be like, it's not my fault. It's your fault. Right. You did this, you did that. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. And so it's about an attack. It's about making people feel like crap. They're going to put people down, and that makes them somehow feel better or not as bad, even though they probably do feel like a big POS. And when they go home at night, they're, thinking back about the day they had and how they treated people. And they're like, and I could tell you, I remember going home at night and not being super extreme in that, but thinking I'm not very proud about how I dealt with that situation.
Absolutely.
Something's wrong, right? Because you haven't figured out the behavior that you want to choose, right? Yeah. It's a reaction. And then assertiveness, assertive communicators do ask a lot of questions. They basically seek to understand what's going on from people's perspective. They understand that although they have a perspective that they believe is right, that everyone's perspective in their own eyes is right. Mm-hmm. Right? So the passive person violates their own rights. The aggressive person violates the rights of others. The assertive person will advocate for themselves and others without the intention of hurting anyone, but yet they're still wanting to be heard and understood, and they want to accomplish something. Now, I will say that, so an aggressive person is going to do more talking, less listening. An assertive person is going to do more listening, more question asking. There's a school of thought that the person asking the questions is the one controlling the conversation. Like, and you're even kind of doing it now. Yeah, I'm going off on all these tangents, and you're like, let's go to the second tenet. Right. So you're reeling us back in. You are in control of where we're headed, right? You have an idea in your mind of the outcome you want to get on this podcast, and you are reeling me back in. I'm answering, you're controlling, and that's why I'm not worried, because I know you got it, right?
Yeah, right.
And so you're assertively taking this podcast down a journey that you saw us going in today.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's assertiveness, because it's your podcast, it's your community. And even the way you run the show is in a way of assertively taking care of yourself and your listeners. Right. That's a good example. But I think women, and so this is where the apology-free thing that I talk about comes into, which is more originally women than men. I wish I had it here. Cheryl was part of giving me this mug that said, I'm not bossy, I just have leadership skills at our holiday party the other day. Sometimes as women, we get called, they'll say, oh, you're being a bitch.
Yep.
You're being bossy, you're being pushy. And women actually, when we're advocating for ourselves or speaking up, we're also often misjudged, also sometimes more by women than men,
Yeah.
of being a boss, of being bitchy, being a boss, being bossy, whatever, being pushy. Because the problem is that, and it's probably less and less now, but culturally, when you think about women in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was not as okay as it is now for women to speak up.
Yes.
Right. So women who are in the, like, let's say Gen Xers ish, not all Gen Xers. Gen X is like the generation that nobody complains about because they're just so, like they're like chameleons. But Gen Xers and baby boomers, like the more seasoned Gen Xers and baby boomers, they would look at women who are speaking up and advocating for themselves and be like, ooh, girl, careful there. So women judge women who speak up for themselves, advocate for themselves. Men sometimes feel like, oh, who is she? And it's tough because for us to get what we want and for us to be bosses and for us to be leaders, we have to be okay speaking up. And we also have to be okay with the fact that some people see it as we're being a bitch or biatch, and other people understand that we're just trying to get stuff done. And so the difference of being assertive and aggressive is when you speak, you are not making anybody else feel bad to get something done. And you're probably asking more questions than telling, right? And you're doing more listening than talking. And so one of the best ways to be an assertive communicator is when somebody, I'll give you an example, like somebody accuses you, well, you're kind of being a bitch or you're being bossy, because that's like the common thing women will deal with.
Yep.
The best way to be assertive is instead of saying, you don't know what you're talking about, like this is assertiveness, because then it's not, because now that's aggressive. You say, I'm really curious. I am working really hard to be an assertive communicator who shows respect to everybody. This is intentional. I'm practicing this. I try to do this in every conversation I have. Can you help me? Just tell me, what did I do or what did I say that you feel makes me a bitch? Mm-hmm. Especially if they use that word, just ask it. Yep. Say, you said I'm being a bitch. Can you tell me what I did or what I said that you feel makes me a bitch or makes me bossy?
Yeah.
I want to make sure I'm being a good boss. I want to make sure that I'm being a good communicator. Yep. And sometimes what will happen is they can't really tell you anything, because it's not about what you did or said. It's just that they're uncomfortable because you're speaking up and you're being assertive. Yep. Right. And you don't have to have them admit there's nothing. All you're doing is trying to get them to think, because you're leading people to have a thought, and it doesn't have to be their outside voice. It can be their inside voice where they're like, oh crap, she's right. Right. It's them. It's the way they see the situation. And that's really what assertiveness is that you don't just roll over, you ask a question to get clarification. Yes. And sometimes that question does not require an answer. Right. It's just an awareness. And you might actually get in, like me with Brooke, you might actually find out you're being a biatch.
There is something you're actually doing to participate.
And I've had a number of people tell me that they've tried this approach and they've actually found out. Like, I remember one woman told me, oh, I did that. And there was a gal that was just really, for a couple of weeks, it was just like, we weren't communicating. It was somebody we always had a good relationship. And all of a sudden she's giving me these snarky looks. And I would say hello to her. She won't say hello back. And I finally just had to nip in the bud. And I said, hey, I just feel like same thing. I feel like there's something going on here. Do I do something to offend you? And the woman goes, yeah, I saw you in the grocery store 2 weeks ago. And I said hello, and you did not say hello back. And the gal says, sometimes I don't have my glasses on. She goes, I think she probably did see me in the grocery store. I didn't see her. She assumed I was just blowing her off. And she goes, so I just said, oh my gosh, if that happened, it's because I didn't have my glasses on. I can't see far. That was not about you. It's just, I didn't see you. I'm so sorry. And then everything was okay after that. Most conflict is something that happened that gave us this sense of meaning of something that we gave meaning to it, but the intention was not that. Yeah. And so to be assertive is to be okay asking questions to understand why this is here, because in most cases you're going to find out it really is not what that person thinks it is or what you think it is, but somebody has to put their big leadership pants on, or their big human pants on, and ask the question. That's assertiveness. It's not about necessarily making a statement. It's about seeking to understand what's going on with everyone.
Yeah.
And then being okay to say, if you are in a position where you need to hold people accountable, is to make a declaration of saying, hey, here's what I would prefer. And I language is going to win every time.
Yeah.
Here's what I would love for you to do next time. Or, so I have a better story in my mind, right? So I'm telling myself a better story, right? The next time you feel this way, can you please just come talk to me immediately?
Yes.
Right. So it's just about it. Assertiveness is pushing the fear aside and be willing to go into the glass. I was a bull in a china shop, going into the china shop. And when you ask questions in the china shop, you're less likely to break the china.
Right.
Because you're being cautious and careful. You're asking questions. You're not doing anything. You're not knocking shelves over, knocking china over. You're just asking questions. You're calm. You're asking questions. You're seeking to understand what's going on with that person, and learn that there probably is something that you did that offended them. So don't be surprised by that.
Right.
Believe me, I offend people all the time.
Yep. I know. Yeah.
Because I am like this extrovert, ambivert person, and I'm doing a lot of talking, and sometimes people are taken back. And then I just let them, sometimes I realize that, when they are, kind of taken back by me, it's probably something going on in their head, that it's something that a belief system they have, and I'm triggering something, I'm pushing a button of theirs that they don't even realize they have. And if that person matters to you, you're just going to be like, hey, I just noticed, like, did I do something or say something that, caused you to have some emotions, because something's coming back from you that I did not intend to cause.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's so true that a lot of times it's these really small things that maybe are causing these really big magnitude issues. I think it's normal. I think it's just normal humans to take things personally, right? I think this is one of the paradoxes of, like, a life lesson that I've learned, is that, we all walk around thinking everybody is paying so much attention to us, or thinking about us or looking at us. And it's like, really, no, because you're in your own head, and everybody else out there too is in their own head thinking the same thing. And when they say something, it's easy to take it as like, well, that was a personal hit at me, or they're upset with me. And a lot of times it is maybe that you didn't say hello to them because you were busy when they came into work, or maybe before they came into work, they had a fight with their spouse and they're still just trying to decompress after that, or they got yelled at by the boss that day. Like, there's all these different things that are playing into our, every human's experience. And I think you brought this beautiful point to it, clarification of just like, I just want to be clear. This is how I'm perceiving things. Is there something that I've done? And then start to ask those clarifying questions. Well, what, and I think a lot of times defining words, because people use words and they don't necessarily always have the language to articulate. I think especially around feelings, right? This is a whole new realm that we're kind of coming into, is like, what am I actually feeling right now? We associate the big four of, it's like anger, sadness, joy, and I honestly can't remember the fourth one right now. Those are the ones that everybody knows, but then there's fine tuning that down to, okay, I feel like it's anger, but what it really is I'm just frustrated. And helping people to find that language. And you do that by asking the clarifying questions.
Yeah. I think I want to circle back a little bit to the body language. You brought that up early on. It's when you're with people, you're not going to be able to actually read the body language unless you've studied it.
Yeah.
But you can pick up a lot on what's going on with people, and you're going to have this inner sense of, and this is where coaches learn to tap into this empathy that they have. Right? Where you're talking with someone and you have a sense for what they're feeling. Yeah. You're not really sure, but you have an idea of like, wow, this person is so sad, and you can feel the sadness in your own body. Well, what happens is that if you think about children learned to understand what's going on around them because of people's body language and tone of voice, not because of the words. Yep. Right. And so we have the ability to pick that up. it's the first way we learn to communicate before we understood language.
Yep.
But then once we started understanding words, we put so much like focus on our words, but really the majority of what people are communicating is more through that's why I say I have to sit on my hands, because if I sit on my hands, I listen, we communicate through our body language. And so you've got to get to a point where if you are doing less talking and more listening, now you're listening not only with your ears, but you're listening with your eyes.
Yep.
Right. And if you're totally focused on that person, you're picking up a lot more from what you're seeing with that person than what they're saying.
Yeah.
And this is where really good coaches can finish your sentences or identify an emotion because they trust their gut, their intuition, because that our gut and intuition, it's not some outside influence. It's our inner knowing as being a human being and having 40 or 20 or 60 years of life experience of observing and studying humans.
Yep.
And then we just have this inner, it's like tapping into a computer that's sitting on our shoulders that knows things that we don't even realize we know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And I'll give you like a silly example of like, this is why words and feelings are not always the same. So I remember my nephew, JJ, who's now like 22 in college. I was hanging out with him when he was like 3.5 years old. And I was, at the time I didn't live in Vegas. So I'd visit and I'd stay at my brother's and sister-in-law's house. And we were playing Nerf basketball in the kitchen. And he kept throwing this Nerf ball and missing. And he'd throw it and miss and go, damn it. And I'm like, oh, Jay, you taught your kid. And he did it like 3 times. Damn it. And I kept saying, JJ, don't say that word. It's a bad word. It's a bad word. And he kept doing it again and again. Finally, I'm like, oh my gosh, he does not, like, he's not comprehending, right? So I said, JJ, the word damn it is a bad word. So I actually said the word and said, the word damn it's a bad word. So then he throws the ball a couple more times, then he misses. He goes, ah. And then he looks at me, goes, ah. So he thought I said, don't have the emotion.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the word, he was expressing an emotion with the word damn it that he did pick up from his parents.
Yeah.
But it was the emotion that he thought I was telling him not to have instead of the word. So this is who we are at our core, what we do, our actions, our words, everything is so tied up into how we're feeling. If you can just allow yourself the gift of shutting up and just watching people, and you can do it on virtual.
Yep.
You can do it in person. You can even sometimes hear it on the phone and just pay attention to what people are doing, how they're moving, how they're acting, what you see. Yeah. You can give them the gift of empathy, which I know you've heard Brene Brown talk about this, the difference between empathy and sympathy. Yeah. Sympathy is when you say something to try to soothe them. Empathy is when you sit in it with them. You don't have to say anything. You just sit there in whatever it is they're sitting in the muck of their life, and you just be a witness to them. It doesn't require words. It just requires your presence. Yep. And if you can do that, that's how you minimize conflict. Yep. Because it's about your presence and your witnessing to them versus what you do. Yeah. Right. It's about it, what you say and solving it. It's just about just witnessing to them as a human being. And if we could, believe me, I'm not always great at this either because I'm a fixer, but if we could just spend more time, being present, witnessing to what people are going through and allowing them to go through it. Yeah. Right. Allowing them to process it, give them the time to feel what they're feeling and move past, then the conflict often can move away with those emotions, right? But instead we're like trying to just go in the center of something that just needs some time and space. I don't know. Right.
Yeah, no, it makes sense in that, and that's like the approach. I think, when I went into coach training, I thought coaching was like, you go in, you have a client, they're like, here's my problem. And you're like, okay, let me get some outside perspective. And I'm going to like help you work through this and give you some solutions. And it was like, absolutely not. That is not what coaching is about. No. It is about helping people to find their own answers. And part of that is tapping into their intuition. Yes. I think, our coaching, the coaching program that I went through, talks about it as energy. You have like these different energies, and I think everybody has experienced this. You just may not have recognized it, that like maybe when your parents were fighting, you could palpate that tension between them. Or when you come into work and maybe two coworkers are not getting along, and you walk in the room and you're like, ooh, this is a gross situation that I don't want to be a part of. Like you've been there and you've experienced that sensation. And I think the practice starts with you, like starting to realize when you're in an emotion, you're like, okay, what is the energy? Like, what is that energy? What does it feel like? And then you start to pick it up from other people, and you're like, oh, I recognize it's like a vibration, which I know sounds very woo woo. It sounds very like ambiguous. Like, how do you actually describe this? But that's like the best language that I have for it is just the sensation that you have, and you pick up on the vibration that somebody's giving out. And once you start to recognize the vibrations in yourself, when you see them in other people, or you're picking that up, it's like, okay, they're in a state of anxiety, they're in a state of this. And then you can start tying it into to like when people are like holding their throat, it's like that is kind of like the sign of like that they don't want to use their voice, or they felt like they are restricted in that sense. Rubbing on chest is like soothing. These are, a lot of this goes into psychology. You can learn body language. But I think a lot of times too, it comes back to like, what do I do when I'm upset about something? Maybe it's like rubbing my temples, or like dropping my head, and you start to pick up on these things in other people, and you can start to tap into, okay, what's going on for them, which I do think it makes you a more effective communicator when you can say, because I think people get surprised. I know this is so true in coaching, when you nail it to a T, what they're feeling without them even having to say what they're feeling, or you point something out to them and they're like, oh God, like there's that light bulb moment, and that's where the shift occurs, right? They can start to make that change. So I think it's super important. And it's interesting to me because as you were talking about the communication types, I know I mentioned to you before we started the recording, the Gottman's 4 horsemen of conflict discussions, which are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling.
Okay.
I think we hit on, criticism is obviously like you're taking personal hits at somebody else. This comes into that passive aggressive where you're intentionally trying to hurt somebody or make them feel, bad. And contempt, I think, kind of ties into that as well, where it's like you're intentionally being mean to make somebody else, to minimize them. Defensiveness, I think we've all been there, right? Where you feel like it's a personal attack, and now I'm going to be defensive in this. And then stonewalling is like that shutdown where it's like, I'm not going to participate in this because I'm too uncomfortable with this situation. And I think all of it comes back to communication.
Yes.
How are you communicating? And I've never heard the 3 types of communication, but I think like that is a perfect tie into all of this.
Yeah. And back to the whole energy thing, like if you've ever said you can cut the tension with a knife, then you can feel energy. You might be thinking, oh, I can't feel that, but we've all felt like you can see and feel what's going on between 2 people. So you may not be as in tune to it when it's you, but if you've seen it happen with other people, you are in tune.
Yes.
And I think if anybody's like, oh, well, how do I tap into that? You already have it. It's just, and honestly, over the years, I've like tried to block it out because sometimes it's almost overwhelming.
Yeah.
When you
opened that floodgate.
Yeah. You're like, okay, zip up or whatever, And so sometimes I feel like I'm often trying not to pay attention or just try it because I don't want to take on too much because it's almost overwhelming, all the feelings. But the reality is we all have the ability. It's just how open you are to just giving yourself. In some ways, it's the gift of, especially with people that you care about, being able to be present and just be open to letting and it's not in your head where you know and understand. It's in your heart. It's in your gut. Right. And if you can, that first moment where you're like, this person's sad or upset or angry, that's the feeling, that's the emotion. It's not what you're thinking. It's what you just pick up, and you have that immediate thought of this is what's going on with that person. And you can do it with people, you can do it with people you don't, but you have to be able to trust yourself and that's really, I think, about part of our growth as human beings is that if you recognize how many years you've been on this earth, right? You're in school of understanding humans and being one yourself. Gives you great insights. And so it's just a matter of that's a collection of experiences that you have that contributes to how you show up and how you understand people. And the whole button pushing thing too, like, you know, that we have the ability to push people's buttons. And sometimes that's what we choose. And I've done it. I mean, if you're human, you've done it. And sometimes you can, if you're smart, you can recognize, okay, maybe today's not the day I push that button, because it is a conscious choice, right? We're making these choices all these times. And sometimes it's fun, you know, to push somebody's button, but what if you push their button on the wrong day? So I think depending on where you are in your life and the people around you and what the expectations are for you and what your expectations are for yourself, you can choose to take a leadership role in the relationships. Because here's the thing about leadership. Leadership is not a title. Right? It's not authority. It's not a position. It's not something anybody gives you. Leadership is something you choose to be a leader, because leadership is about your relationships. Right? Leadership is about how you show up and how you treat people. And leadership is probably even a bad word for it in a way, because it's really about, you know, you owning responsibility for every relationship you have. And if you're a parent, you have to be able to put your own emotions aside and just be present for the people around you. But then if you listen to the podcast with Cheryl, you also have to know there are times to listen to your own heart and make decisions that are best for you. Because if you don't do that, now you can't give your best to the people around you. Right. So you also have to know when you have to say no or create some boundaries, because if you're not filling up your own cup, you have nothing to give out of your cup. And that's when you say, okay, you know, I'm going to go, like she does, hiking, you know, or I'm going to go meditate, or I'm going to go to a fitness class, or I'm going to go paint, or whatever it is you do. So you're filling up your own cup. So then when you are in these positions, these relationships where you can show up and just be the one that gives 100%, even though other people aren't, you can allow them that space in that room, you know, to process. And it doesn't always have to be the conflict. And I think that I love that. Is it Gottman's?
Yep. The Gottmans.
Yeah. So those are choices that add to the conflict. Right. The shutting down is the flight. The button pushing, you know, that's the fight. Right. What were the other two?
It's criticism,
That's
contempt.
Contempt
is so when we're communicating in the state, this is where you're intentionally mean to somebody.
That's aggressiveness, like belittling.
Defensiveness is typically a response to criticism. So like, I felt like what you said is a character attack on me, and now I'm going to be defensive back to you. And then stonewalling is usually the response to contempt, where it's like somebody is intentionally mean, and I think that's another one that you feel when somebody is being intentionally mean to you, and the response is to just wall up, shut down, disengage from the conversation.
And none of those are good choices.
No, I honestly, what I should have done too in my notes is there's an antidote for each one of these, that it's like, if you recognize this is your go-to conflict style, here's the antidote to start practicing to like switch that to the more positive, healthy communication and conflict style. So I'll have to put a link to that in the show notes so that people can kind of go and look and see and figure out your type. Because I think everybody knows their love language that was so popularized. You know, I feel like that was 20 years ago that book came out, but I don't think a lot of people have done the work around recognizing what is my conflict language, and then what do I need to do to be able to make that a more healthy, positive way of showing up in relationship. And I love that. Like, again, this is one of those things that you said, and I'm like, oh, so it's not just me. Like, it can be overwhelming sometimes when you tap into the energy of yourself sometimes alone, let alone being open to the energy of other people. I didn't make this realization in the first part of my career in healthcare. I would come home from work and just be exhausted because you're picking up in all of this things from your patients, from your coworkers, from all the people. The hospital is a busy place.
Yeah.
And I would come home and just have to like shut down, like go lay down to let that energy well come back up before I could go do the things and like engage with other people again.
Yeah.
And then it was like later on, after making that realization, that it was like, okay, I was just like letting all that energy come in and taking it on. Whereas now I have to be protective of that. And I think that is actually the mark of a good leader, is when they can recognize that they don't have the space to take on the energy and saying like, I need to take a beat from this conversation, or I'm not in a place today that I can have this conversation, but I acknowledge it. I'm validating that, yes, we need to have this conversation. Can we schedule it for another time? Because I think too many people go into conflict with all this other baggage, and that's not serving anybody in that situation.
Yeah. And that's probably the more passive approach, is not saying, wait a minute, right? Because passive people will eventually implode, aggressive people explode. An assertive person would say, you know what? I value our relationship, and I am not in an emotional or mental space right now to give you the attention that I know you deserve. So can you just give me an hour or a day or whatever it is, right? And, here's the thing. Sometimes it feels like it's a burden to be the one person that communicates better than a lot of other people around you, but somebody has to be able to do that. Sometimes if you can practice this and get good at it, you may realize that, okay, I've gotten better at this, and because of it, it makes my relationships better. I wish other people were better at this, but at least I'm good at it. Right.
And I think there's so much power in role modeling, right? It's like, it can be frustrating if you're like the one person in the group of 10 that actually communicates well. Everybody else is like going through the 4 different conflict languages, and you're like, oh, you're a stonewaller, you're defensive, you're criticism, and you're over there like trying to like reel everybody back into that. It can be very frustrating in that sense. And I think that's the practice when you start to do this work of being a better communicator, is role modeling the behavior of this is what good communication looks like. This is what it looks like when I'm not in a place to have communication. And I think this comes up in intimate relationships, when you start to fight and you realize you don't have the capacity for it. There's nothing wrong with saying, I need to go take a walk for 15 minutes and like let this come back down to baseline before I have this conversation. I think that's the healthiest thing you can do if you make that recognition, instead of just going into it and trying to force the conflict to happen. And I think, this is probably an unpopular belief, the whole going to bed angry thing. I think sometimes it happens. Like you just have to take it to bed, and you have to get a good night's sleep before you can come back and approach things in the morning from a clear, fresh perspective. I don't think you should hold on to it. It turns into resentment, and that's never, good. That's where contempt comes in a lot of the time. But I think recognition of that need for space, it's a boundary, is super important in this.
Well, and somebody who's more, and we get back to the introverts and extroverts, an introvert is going to need time to process. And if you don't give them that time, it's going to create more resentment. So, and introverts, they're always giving up energy, whereas extroverts are collecting energy when they're with people. So an extrovert and an introvert in a conflict, the extrovert is like wanting to resolve it, and they're gaining energy from the resolution. And the introvert is feeling like they're already depleted, and now you're just asking me to go to like negative, right? So that's just that understanding that the introvert they're going to be best in resolving. And if you give them some time to step away and process and think it through, and add a little energy to their battery so that you can work through it together. So, I mean, that's a really good point too, of there's so much to this. And I think in the end, like, no, you're not, I mean, I've spent 40 years of my adult life understanding people, and then reading a lot of books about learning. I mean, introverts and extroversion is something I just started learning more the last 3 years. So you're not gonna be able to go read all the books and figure it all out. Right. But I think the key is you got to decide who you want to be, how you want to show up in relationships. And then always, and I think even when it comes to those 4 responses to conflict, is ask yourself, okay, what is happening in this situation? What belief do I have about myself that's causing me to shut down, stonewall, or attack, or be defensive? Why am I choosing this? What am I feeling emotionally right now? And if you can go within and ask yourself questions within, that's going to help give you some view of what's going on. And it may even reveal a self-limiting belief that you have to do a little work on.
Yeah.
Right. But you own your own response, your own reaction, and don't try to put that on somebody else, and just own the results you're getting. And if you can try to show up and be 100%, intentional about your relationships, and give 100% to every relationship you have that's of value to you, you'll end up being prouder of those moments that could have gone a different direction, and I think, and then the listening, if we circle back to that, the more time you do observing and paying attention versus talking, you can see what's going on with that person and trust your gut of what they're feeling. If you pick up on an emotion and you feel it, it's probably something coming from them. And in the end, it just comes down to, do you value the people around you enough to do the work on yourself so you can give them the best version of you every day? Right. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, as you were talking about the introversion, extroversion, like in conflict, I'm kind of like, as I was thinking about that, I'm like, I wonder if in every relationship, like I typically am more of an introvert, but there's definitely relationships that I have with introverts where I am more extroverted than they are. So I'm kind of actually thinking, like, is it possible to be introvert and introvert in a communication style, because both people are kind of holding back? So I think there's almost a natural tendency, and I think it will probably just naturally surface who in the relationship is more extroverted and who's more introverted. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, so they say, I think the numbers are 50 to 70% of people are extroverts, 30 to 50% are introverts. That's a really wide scale.
Yeah.
And then the ambiverts are the people that don't have the extreme of either. So they're not extreme extroverts or extreme introverts. And it depends on, a lot of times I think it's situational, right? So an introvert, introverted people can be, have a little bit more ease in communicating when they're around people they know versus people they don't. Right. And I think even over your life, you can change. Cause I feel like I was much more extroverted when I was younger. And I kind of blame the pandemic for me becoming more of an ambivert because of all those years of being a shut-in with, a couple of years being a shut-in with my dog. And I found that I really actually do now recharge in quiet time. And I used to recharge at happy hour.
Yeah.
So
I feel the same way. As I've gotten older, I've leaned a lot more heavily into introversion, which I think for me, I think that started after getting divorced, because I knew I needed to take the space to figure out who I was, because so much of my identity was tied up in like that relationship, that identity, that it was like, I put a self-imposed restriction on, like, I'm not going to date, which closed a lot of my social activities down. And then it was just about being in those close relationships with friends and like really fostering that, but also learning how to be by myself. And then I kind of almost went to the opposite extreme where it's like, I got so comfortable being by myself that it was like, well, we'll just stay home and not go out and like actually be a part of society in the world. And then the pandemic just compounded that even more. So now I feel like it's like, I'm at that point, the podcast has helped with that a lot, of like getting back out there and being like in an extroverted way. So I think in a sense, I've heard people call it like, I'm an introverted extrovert, or an extroverted introvert, like, but I think ambivert, that's the first time
ambivert. They don't tolerate the extremes of others or of either one. So they're somewhere in the middle. And that's, I call and there's actually online quizzes that you can take that you answer like a bunch of questions, and then it'll tell you if you lean one way or the other, or if you're somewhere in the middle. And some of it does have to do with how you recharge your batteries, how you get your energy back, what type of social situations you like, how you process your day, so a lot of questions like that will help you kind of And if you do a little bit of both, you might be more like an ambivert than just
Yeah.
an extreme extrovert or extreme introvert.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
That's interesting. I think it's important to don't box yourself into like a definition, right? I mean, it's
yeah.
like we just said, it's a fluid spectrum.
Yes.
I was definitely more extroverted in my younger years, but I think there's a lot of life influences. We change as people, what we value changes as we get older. We
Yes.
start to realize what's really important to us. And I think that can get labeled as introversion, extroversion, when it's just like, you're just a changing human being. And that's the normal process that kind of comes with that.
Well, and I think that's really important because I know what I've noticed is I feel like the younger generations don't like labels,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So it's not about putting people into categories and generalizations. The whole point is paying attention to what people like and don't like. Some of these introvert, extrovert, and personality tests, some of these things, generations, these are ways to understand some of the general values of people. But the real way to get to know people is to observe and listen and ask questions. And, no person's going to fit into these different definitions perfectly. But if you're open to the fact that we all have different ideas and different values and different life experiences, and you're willing to observe and ask questions, then you get to know the human, and then you know what their preferences are, and you know how to show up in the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Kathi, I have enjoyed this. I feel like we could just keep talking for days about, like, there were so many rabbit holes that were so tempting to be like, oh, let's go down that one. If people want to learn more about you, what you're doing, the work you're doing, where would they find you out in the world?
So you can definitely, so I'm on LinkedIn, so my first name is Kathi, Kathi, right? Kathi. So you can find me on my website, Kathi Speaks, right? The word speaks.com. You could certainly email me, Kathi@kathyspeaks.com. I'm on LinkedIn. My first name's Kathi, the last name Kulesza, which I'm sure will be in the show notes. Just find me anywhere. Most of my handles are Kathi Speaks, with Kathi with an I, Kathi Speaks. And just hit me up somewhere. Let me know that you listened to the podcast and you made it till this point. Because we've been this was fun. The time went so fast.
It is amazing how fast it goes. I mean, and then you I think season 1, I kind of tried to limit all the conversations to an hour, and there was several that it was just like, there's just no way. And this is one of those topics that there's so many different ways to approach this. There's so many just different distinctions that you have to make in it that I think it's impossible to cover it really, even in an hour and a half, I think is what we're at right now. So I've been wrapping up this season with one question to all guests, just kind of seeing the difference in responses. And if I were to offer up the phrase to thrive in life, what comes up for you?
Thrive in life. I feel like this is such an important question. Like, I have to get this right. Yeah. I mean, I would say to thrive in life, and this is just be where I am right now because of the work I do and the challenges with my mom, and I feel like right now, the biggest life lesson that I'm seeing play out with my mother is that, we go through this entire life, and I'm 61, I'm not young. And, the hope is as you get older, you can have some joy and rest and relaxation and peace in your older years. And so to thrive in life, I think it's to prepare yourself. So those last, whatever it is, 10, 15, 20 years of your life, you can be at peace. And so you've really got to work on your mindset, your belief system to the core of who you are, and really dig deep and own, how you feel about yourself, how you view yourself, who you are, how you show up. And you can't just change the behavior. You've got to change the belief system. And don't worry about where it came from. It's about, as an adult, own a responsibility for rewriting some of those beliefs, because, we got them. Like, most of my beliefs that don't serve me honestly did come from my mother and my father, but they did the best they could. I was the first child to a 20 and 24-year-old. I did not pop out of the womb with a user manual.
Right.
They did the best they could with what they knew in a generation that's different than it is today. So as an adult, you can blame your parents, your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, and just blame it on them and don't take ownership, or you can own responsibility for who you are as a human being and do that work, because the one person you're guaranteed to spend your end years with is yourself. And so you're going to be stuck in your mind. And that's a trap that can be a joyful place to be in your end years, or it can be a torturous place to be. So to thrive in life is to really learn every life lesson that you can, and to own the responsibility for who you are and how you show up in the world. And the most important person to take care of is yourself.
Absolutely. I love that. That's great. It's so true and so different than every other response that I've gotten so far. So I love just seeing all the different responses that come in. And I think when you put them all together, it's like, there's your user manual for how to live life. So Kathi, I really appreciated this. And I'm sure at some point I would love to have you back. And there's so many different topics again that we could dive into here. So thank you so much for taking the time today to come on and talk about this super important topic. And I'm sure we'll have you back on the show at some point.
Hey, Kristen, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Like, I always expect to enjoy it, but it was even more enjoyable than I thought it would be. So, and I'm glad to be here during an important time for us to be thinking about, the new year. And maybe there's a book, in your future with all these podcast guests.
Yeah, you never know. I actually kind of started to write a book when I was taking care of my dad. And it got sidebarred as life gets busy and things, but it's I think that's such an important, right? It's writing your story. And I think everybody's story is important. But to your point, we always have the opportunity to begin again and write the story how we want it to be, and write a better story. So
yeah,
absolutely. All right, Kathi, we'll see you soon.
All right. See ya.